9:30, which means that he would have had to kill her, taken her body to a different location, and then been back to his apartment in Logansport, 40 minutes away, making a casual phone call by 10 a.m. It just wasn't working with the timeline as they knew it. But investigators knew if they were off on the timing of Darlene's murder by even 15 minutes, it would have been possible, although still a big stretch. And just in case you're wondering, police did track down the person that Ricky called that morning just to verify that it had been him on the phone from his apartment. And they said, yeah, it was him, and it was a totally normal, everyday phone call. Nothing damning about it. They also tracked down a woman whose name was on a pill bottle in Ricky's apartment. Now, police at first had assumed that these were stolen meds, but the woman said that she had been sort of dating Ricky, and in fact, she had dropped off the pills at his apartment on the afternoon of the 17th. And she said that Ricky was there at home just kind of lounging around. So it's not like he really even left after making this phone call. Police were feeling pretty on the fence about Ricky. At least, that is, until the crime lab results came back. The ISP testing confirmed that it was in fact blood on Ricky's stuff, and that blood appeared to be consistent with Darlene's blood type. Now, blood testing, especially at the state levels back then, was super generic. It basically could just tell you type O or type A, etc. And they knew that if they were going to nail this guy, especially with a tight timeline that they would be working with, they would need something definitive. So they asked the FBI to perform their own tests since they had more advanced equipment. They analyzed the same samples, and their findings were that it was definitely not Darlene's blood on Ricky's stuff. Just to be extra sure he wasn't connected to the crime scene, police also arranged to get one of Ricky's hairs sent to Indiana from Texas and had it tested against a few of the hairs found at Darlene's house, the ones on her body and on baby Kristen's foot. And it turns out that none of those hairs matched Ricky's. Actually, all but one of the hairs turned out to be Darlene's. So the blood and the hairs weren't a match. But the list of crimes that Ricky had been accused of was long. After the robbery in Texas, Amarillo police sent notices to police departments about Ricky's death, and they got like a dozen calls back from officers saying that he was wanted for crimes in their areas, mostly armed robberies throughout the Midwest. Just to be extra thorough, police continued doing interviews regarding Ricky. They talked to this guy named Joe Cripp, who was apparently Ricky's BFF. With Ricky dead, police figured Joe was the next best person to talk to because the two were super tight. Joe said that his buddy Ricky, RIP, couldn't have abducted or killed anyone back in August because he had actually wrecked his motorcycle in July and was barely able to walk for months after that. He didn't think Ricky would have been able to struggle with anyone or move a body in the condition that he was in. Joe also laughed off the fact that Ricky had cut out that newspaper clipping about a fugitive police were looking for, because the fugitive was Ricky. Ricky thought it was hilarious that he'd been fleeing from police and actually got away with it by hiding in a cornfield. It wasn't because he had anything to do with Darlene's death. The next question police asked Joe was if Ricky had any access to green cars, and in fact, he did. Joe said that Ricky had bought a 4-door early 70s green Maverick off a girl they knew. He couldn't remember when Ricky drove the car, though, so police followed up with that girl that he mentioned, and she said that Ricky had borrowed the green car back in September and then bought it off her in early October before going to Texas. She said that she couldn't remember Ricky using the car before September. But then, police got a call from a guy named Mike Murphy, who said that Ricky had bought a green car off him over the summer.
Anytime you're having trouble getting out of bed in the morning, just think about your favorite breakfast at McDonald's. See? Problem solved. Right now at McDonald's, wake up for a sausage McMuffin and hash browns. Mix and match 2 for just $3.69. More of a burrito person? We have you covered. Right now, get 2 sausage burritos for just $3.49. And remember to save time by ordering ahead on the app. Price of participation may vary. Single item at regular price. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Hey, this is Jeff Lewis from Radio Andy. Live and uncensored, catch me talking with my friends about my latest obsessions, relationship issues, and bodily ailments. With that kind of drama that seems to follow me, you never know what's going to happen.
You can listen to Jeff Lewis live at home or anywhere you are. Download the SiriusXM app for over 425 channels of ad-free music, sports, entertainment, and more. Subscribe now and get 3 months free. Offer details apply.
Here's a reenactment of Sergeant Yokolet's interview with Mike.
The way we understand it, he bought a car from you.
Yeah, a 1974 two-door Ford Brougham, green.
That was a green one?
Mm-hmm.
Is that supposed to be the same one that he wrecked later on, or a girl had wrecked?
A girl had wrecked it, as far as I know.
There were other times that Ricky came to your house?
Yes, sir.
Kind of just basically tell me what would take place when he was over here, or what pretext he would come over on.
He would just come over to visit. Kids around. Just shoot the breeze, put it that way.
In talking with other people and in talking with you, he was the type of individual that bragged a lot?
Yeah.
Okay. Did he ever brag to you or show off to you as far as telling you that he was involved in any other crimes? Doing any crime?
No, not until after. You know, Sam or Joe or one of them told me that he had been in Medaryville, or something in Medaryville when he was younger. And then he told me what had been his priors, but he told me that he had gone on the straight and narrow.
After that, the questioning switched to something about a gun that Mike said Ricky stole from him. And it's a bit of a reach, but you can tell Sergeant Yokolet has his reasoning for asking. Basically, one of the guns that Ricky had in his car when he died in Texas was the one that Mike used to keep under his mattress. That gun used to belong to Mike's brother, who was also murdered in Argus, like 10 years prior, but not far from the Hulse home. In Sergeant Yokolet's report of his interview with Mike, he wrote, quote, "It is not known for certain if there's any connection at this time between the homicide of Darlene Hulse to any of the other homicides that have taken place several years ago. However, it appears to this officer to be very coincidental that the weapon that was in the possession of a suspect in the Darlene Hulse investigation originally belonged to an individual that was killed on State Road 110, that it was believed his death was also possibly a homicide." End quote.
I'm interested in the case in Argus, where the woman got killed. Is there anything you can explain to me that you've heard from other people, around or Ricky?
Well, to tell the truth, I didn't think he did it. And, you know, and then Bob come up one night and talked to me.
Bob?
Ingle.
Okay.
And I just asked him, I said, "Do you think that he could have did it?" And Bob looked at me and says, if the girl approached him, you know, and spooked him and caught him off guard, you know, yeah, he might have did it out of pure fright and didn't know what the heck to do with her. When he was around here, the wife said he acted strange, but you know, anybody who walks into the house to her is gonna act strange. He was a very intelligent man, you know. He just pulled stupid bullshit.
Finally, police interviewed Ricky's wife, Christine. The two had separated in early 1984, but they had a 2-year-old kid together. Christine told police that for the first 2 weeks of August, Ricky had their son with him in Logansport. She said that on August 13th, he had returned him to her house, and at that time, Ricky was still suffering from his injuries that he had gotten in the motorcycle accident. Christine said that Ricky could walk, but that it was really difficult for him. She also said that Ricky had a bad temper, but she didn't come right out and say that she thought he was capable of murdering someone. After all their interviews, investigators had a few key takeaways. They basically knew Ricky was a full-time robber, and he liked to brag about his crimes. He had bragged about being wanted by the Maryville, Indiana PD to his wife and Joe before going to Texas. So if he had been wanted for murder, wouldn't he have at least told Joe? Or mentioned that he'd gone too far and had to skip town? If you're making your living stealing cash from people, being wanted for murder might lend some street cred to your reputation. In November 1984, the Plymouth Bureau of the South Bend Tribune published an article with the headline, "Not Likely, Dead Man is Killer." Sergeant Yokolet was quoted in that story basically saying things weren't adding up for Ricky Mock like they had hoped. Most of it came back to that 10 a.m. phone call that he had made from his apartment on August 17th. But Ron Hulse, probably to try and comfort his daughters, decided to cling to the Ricky Mock theory. Here's Kristen and Marie.
And Dad had always told us growing up that they had caught the guy, don't worry about it.
Because we were scared.
That he was shot and killed in Texas robbing a bank. And I'm like, that's just so
Didn't make sense.
far-fetched.
When he talked to me about it, it was always just, you're safe, you're okay, they've caught him. Because when I was little, I was scared. I was scared he was going to come back, and I would have nightmares.
I imagine Ron was doing everything he could to try and comfort the girls. And maybe at that time it was easier to believe that Ricky did it because he was dead. Maybe it comforted him in a way too. But in fall 1984, if there had ever been any case to make against Ricky Mock, it fizzled out faster than it came together, just as it had for Robert Zabrowski and Danny Bender. For a moment, police considered pivoting and going back to interrogating Danny even harder. But a few days after his Dear Thelma letter from jail, police got a call from the Illinois State Police. One of their troopers recalled stopping two hitchhikers on August 15th, just across the Illinois state line from Indiana. It was Danny Bender and his friend Tim. They were headed out west, just like they told detectives here, and they didn't have any active warrants. Danny had even gotten permission from his parole officer to leave the state, so the Illinois state trooper let them go. Police knew that it would have been nearly impossible for Danny to have found his way back to Argus by the morning of the 17th, so they knew they had to move on. If you look at old news coverage in the weeks after Darlene's murder, it is all about Danny, Robert, and Ricky. You can sense how desperate police were to find the monster who viciously took Darlene away from her family. And it's easy to see why police zeroed in on them. They were all hard-partying guys who were caught up in various shady activities in and around Argus. People who had dealings with those men heard about something bad that had happened, and they were like, well, it must have been one of them. And it seemed as if police wanted it to be one of them. They were drifters. Anywhere they went, trouble followed. That kind of random tragedy seems easier for the community to handle, because the subtle message is, it's not one of us. It's someone from the outside, someone who was always bad, someone who you could spot a mile away. But it wasn't so simple. None of the men connected directly, only indirectly and through lots of other petty criminals. And the circumstantial evidence that could have possibly tied any of them to Darlene was shaky at best. 2 months into a murder investigation in a small town, that's not the type of information detectives want to have to admit when reporters call, or when members of the community stop them at the grocery store or the cafe to ask for updates in finding the despicable man who killed the sweet stay-at-home mom. So as investigators prepared to hit the reset button on their investigation, they had to finally grapple with their worst fear, that whoever killed Darlene was living among them. And as police were coming to terms with that, the Argus community was living in fear. If something so horrible could happen to sweet, straight-laced Darlene Hulse, were any of them safe, especially in their homes?
As far as bad habits, the only one I ever got her on was the fact that at night she never pulled the drapes or pulled the shade down. She just thought that we lived out in a remote area. Anybody that's out there is going to be sick anyway, and if I went into the bedroom first, was going to shower or something, then I always pulled them down. She never did. She never did. And I just wonder now if there's been someone looking all along or what.
That's coming up in episode 6, Evil All Around. You can listen to that right now.
Bedtime is rough, even for Peanut. That's why people will try anything to fall asleep. Headstands before bed, even blowing bubbles. But Ashley has a trick that works every time. A new Tempur-Pedic mattress. It adapts to your body's needs to help you fall asleep faster and stay asleep longer. You'll wake up feeling refreshed every day. Even Peanut agrees. So ditch the wacky bedtime rituals. Head to Ashley to take home a Tempur-Pedic today.
This episode of The Deck Investigates is brought to you by CarMax, a great place to get pre-qualified and buy your next used car. Because CarMax has you covered, even when times are tough, with affordable upfront pricing on thousands of vehicles. And you can even get pre-qualified and shop a nationwide inventory with your personalized monthly payment with no impact to your credit score. So you can save time searching and spend more time doing what you love and finding the car that's right for you. Get pre-qualified and learn more at CarMax.com. CarMax, car buying reimagined.
Do you know how much your wireless is costing you? Probably a lot more than you think. But with Consumer Cellular, you can get talk, text, and data for just $20 a month. Consumer Cellular also offers flexible plans, nationwide coverage to 99% of the U.S. population, no contract, and a 30-day risk-free guarantee. Plus, you keep your number and your phone. Make the switch today. Go to ConsumerCellular.com to get started.
Before moving on to other suspects whose names were coming in via phone calls and letters from the public, investigators knew what they had to do next. Give Ron Hulse another polygraph test. I say another because they actually gave him one just 3 days after Darlene's abduction, which he passed. And listen, Ron was never a suspect. But back then, officers knew that they had to play offense and defense. And if this case were to ever go to trial, police knew that Ron would be an easy target for a defense attorney. So they had to formally rule him out, not just as a suspect, but of any involvement. Plus, talking with Ron was a great way for investigators to learn more about Darlene.
As far as bad habits, the only one I ever got her on was the fact that at night she'd never pull the drapes or pull the shade down. She just thought that we lived out in a remote area. Anybody that's out there is going to be sick anyway, and if I went into the bedroom first, was going to shower or something, then I always pulled them down. She never did. She never did. And I just wonder now if there's been someone looking all along or what.
Up to this point, they had kind of skimmed over Darlene's lifestyle and personality because A, nothing really stuck out as a red flag, and B, they were hot on the trails of Danny Bender, Robert Zabrowski, and Ricky Mock. But it was time to understand more about their victim and her husband. So in October 1984, they sat Ron down again. This is episode 6, Evil All Around.
At your request, Ronald Glenn Hulse was examined on the polygraph, a detection of deception technique. In the pretest, the subject gave the following information and admissions. Subject stated he knew why he was there, reference, he had been asked by Detective Criswell to take a polygraph, reference, to cover all the bases, reference, of the investigation into his wife's death. Subject stated he had nothing to do with his wife's death, Darlene, and that he had not contacted anyone to come in and take her from the home and kill her, and that he did not know that Darlene was going to be taken from the house on August 17th, and that he did not know that she was going to be killed. Subject advised he's never talked with Danny Bender and that he's never talked with anyone in particular about his finances. He advised that several people at work knew that his dog would have been gone that week, but that was something that he had talked about for quite some time, wanting to have his dog bred.
Marshall County Lieutenant Ed Criswell conducted the Q&A part of Ron's interview, and he started off asking where Darlene did her shopping to try and establish her routine.
As far as incidentals, it was always done at either the mall up at Scottsdale or 3D in Rochester. I'd say 75% of it was done at 3D.
And how about Argus? Did you do any shopping at Argus at all?
Oh, the parking shop and stuff like that, you know, for odds and ends, but she didn't like to go into Argus very often like that. Things were too high.
Okay. She did most of her buying in...
Rochester.
What were some of her habits? What were her daily routine?
Well, as far as getting up, generally 6:45 was always, the alarm was always set for 6:45. Bathing the children, getting them ready in the summer, you know. She liked to take off around 10 or 10:30 in the morning. She wouldn't go anywhere. She's been going lately to Jellystone Pool, trying to go there once a week. Last year, she had gone to Lake Maxinkuckee. I don't think she's gone there this year at all. Jellystone Pool.
Okay. Do you have a membership out there?
No, she's got a girlfriend she usually went with that knew someone that got her in for nothing all the time. About the only other place she went would be piano lessons for the kids, that's all. Otherwise, she's pretty much a homebody. She wasn't one to go out. I had the old car at home, and it was terrible on gas. We really watched that. So if we went anyplace, it was as a family in the evening.
I understand you said something to one of the officers about her having an exercise routine.
Okay. There for a while, she hasn't done this now for a few weeks, she'd take a walk around the square. She'd go east from the house down to 110, all the way down to 31 and back. That was her exercise, just walking.
Lieutenant Criswell asked Ron to recap the week before the abduction, trying to see if he remembered anything weird happening.
I tell you, of all the weeks we've had this summer, I'd say that was about the least active week we've had. She's been doing a lot of canning at home, except for one day on Wednesday previous to the incident. She hadn't gone anywhere. She's been putting the garden up. I think she just finished it up Thursday evening. It's been a pretty boring week for her.
Ron said the only thing out of the routine for that week was the fact that they were having issues with their new refrigerator, and a guy named Lee Chisholm, who owned the nearby appliance store where they bought the fridge, was going to come by and take a look.
We called him, and he was supposed to come down shortly then and fix it. As it turned out, he was on his way at 9:30 that morning and drove by the road and said, well, I promised I'd call first, so he kept driving and went into Rochester.
Now, you'd guess the next questions might have been about this Lee guy who was apparently supposed to be arriving at the Hulse home on the exact day, at the exact time Darlene was attacked. Well, you'd be wrong. Instead, Lieutenant Criswell asked Ron what was wrong with his refrigerator light, and then they moved on to talking about their relatives, basically to gauge if there were any creepy boyfriends of Darlene's sisters that had come around or anything like that. Ron said no, pretty much everyone within their immediate and distant circles were upstanding people. Ron admitted that there was some family drama between them and Darlene's parents regarding a family business, but it wasn't anything serious. They both came from religious families and weren't ones to let greed or spite destroy relationships. They were good, church-going folk who were all about love and giving. And speaking of church, Lieutenant Criswell then asked Ron why he and Darlene had hopped around to lots of different churches lately. Why not just stick with one?
We went to First Baptist. We went for about a year and a half and just felt like we weren't getting what we needed. So we visited a couple other, and when we visited, it was generally just for a Sunday or two, and then we'd move on and got back to the First Baptist for a while, and then we'd settle in down at Liberty Baptist down in Rochester. There's probably a half dozen churches that we'd visited in the last, 2.5 years.
Well, what exactly were you looking for?
We're not out to be entertained. We want good, basic Bible doctrine. Okay, a lot of these people are out for the Sunday school programs for the kids and this and that. We're not. We just want a good preacher. That's all we're looking for.
Your social life, then, would probably mainly revolve around the church.
Even then, we didn't have much contact. We were not partygoers. We only go out to eat once in a couple months. Pretty thrifty, not extravagant.
Well, during your travels from one church to the other, was there ever a time that you felt that someone had taken a special interest in Darlene? You and I both know that usually you can tell when somebody's a little interested.
No, I really can't.
Anybody contact her from the church?
Well, we were always getting letters from the other churches and stuff, thanking us for our visitation and stuff. But as far as... we had a couple of pastors come over for a visit, but no. Darlene was a hard person to talk to. She was real quiet, and she wasn't really one to open up to anyone. So I was generally around her all the time. If people called ahead of time, she'd make arrangements so I could be there too. She was pretty quiet and shy. No, I can't think of anyone. No, if there had been, she would have told me. She'd have been awfully shook up.
How about your marriage to Darlene in general? Did you guys communicate?
Never went to bed mad, not once.
You had differences, though.
Oh, we've always had arguments and stuff, but no sleeping on the couch or running off to Mama's house, not once.
Ever had any fights? What I mean, you ever slap her, or...
No.
Or she ever slap you?
No. Sounds like a fairy book, but we've really got a good marriage.
Ron passed the polygraph with the conclusion stating, quote, "After careful analysis of this subject's polygrams, it is in the opinion of the examiner that he told substantially the truth during his examination," end quote. Police never questioned Ron's alibi since he was at work when the crime happened, coupled with the fact that the girls saw the intruder and it wasn't anyone they recognized. But there had been some hushed whispers about him around town not long after the murder, because Ron gave an interview to the local paper, the Pilot News, saying, quote, "I just know it's his will. Darlene was ready. I'm ready whenever he wants to take me," end quote. He went on to say in that same article that he didn't understand why something so awful would happen to his wife, but that it must have been God's will. He said, quote, "I don't understand, but I accept it." People side-eyed those remarks, and gossip spread. Even online today, sometimes people point the finger at him. Sure, he wasn't the one who took Darlene, they'll say. Otherwise, his daughters would have seen him. But he could have maybe hired someone. But let me tell you, that makes no sense. Darlene's attack was anything but a professional job. The attacker didn't come prepared. He used her fire poker to subdue her. Ron is not now, nor has he ever been, a suspect. And listen, I get his comments may feel strange to some people. I'm not very religious myself, but I do come from a family that was. And I understand what he said. It was something that he could hold on to in a time where his whole life was upended. He also told the reporter that he thought Darlene's attack was random, which might have also been comforting in some way. After losing Darlene, Ron tried his best to be there for his daughters. But Marie said that some things were harsh reminders of what the family had lost. Things like mornings spent with their mom.
My dad hired a babysitter. Her name was Lori. And I remember being aggravated because she was fine, but I was like, I don't want to see her first thing in the morning. And she was there instead of my dad. And it just felt lonely. I mean, my aunts chipped in, but it was more like, from my memory, they would watch us like after school, not first thing in the morning. And I remember the mornings being hard to me. I didn't like the mornings anymore.
Eventually, the family established a new routine. Ron went back to work, the girls went back to school, and Ron remarried a woman named Chris. One of Darlene's friends had actually set Ron up with Chris, and the girls went on his first date with her.
I think that when she married my dad, I know that she loved us and she didn't think she could have children. So, you look at it from that perspective, like, I don't know that I could marry someone with 3 small children and take that role on. So that was a huge sacrifice on her part.
Chris had been a substitute teacher in Argus, so the girls were familiar with her prior to her dating and marrying their dad. And the two are still together today. As Ron continued trying to rebuild their life and establish a new one with his new wife, police were going back to the drawing board. In an effort to draw in some new information, they went knocking on doors in Argus. Police really wanted to know if anyone else had any problems with peeping toms or harassing phone calls or literally anything. One woman named Karen said she noticed a white car watching their house during evening hours, but it had been months since she'd last seen it. In fact, she said, she hadn't seen it since Darlene's murder. Another couple said their 18-year-old daughter had gotten creepy phone calls from a man. They said the man would ask when her dad would be home, how old she was, and if her parents were home. A woman named Marcia, who lived nearby with her family, said that she'd also gotten some creepy phone calls in the past year, mainly heavy breathing and dirty talk. Similarly, a neighbor named Rex said that his household had gotten some calls with filthy language, and they had happened 3 or 4 times since Darlene was killed. Rex also said they had one strange visitor who said that he was a preacher, but he had a car full of girls with him. And then some other neighbors reiterated rumors that police were already familiar with, involving Ricky Mock and Danny Bender. Since so many people had talked about having phone calls from creepy men, and because so much time had passed and investigators were really starting to spiral, police decided to look into other crimes that they may have missed before. Maybe smaller things like break-ins, thefts, whatever. And they actually found a crime that interested them. A break-in, an attempted sexual assault that happened at a house just a stone's throw away from where Darlene's body was found.
Hi, it's Ted here, the unofficial spokesperson for Consumer Cellular, with some very official advice. All right, how do I put this lightly? Your wireless provider is overcharging you. Well, that was easier than I thought it would be. So, get the exact same coverage as the major carriers at half the cost. Switch and save up to $250 a year on all the talk, text, and data you need at consumercellular.com.
It happened in December 1982. It was early in the morning, and a woman was at home asleep when her phone rang. The man on the other end asked if her husband was home, and the woman, I'll call her Pam, said that no, he was at work and he wouldn't be home until later that evening. They hung up, and soon after, a man came bursting through her front door and running down her hallway to her bedroom. The man pinned her to the bed, but Pam was able to fight him off before he was able to assault her, and he gave up and ran back out the front door. In 1985, when police went back to look at the details of this case and compare it to Darlene's, Pam's case was still unsolved, and the location was almost eerie. The woman's home, where she was attacked, was just across State Road 110 from where Darlene's body had been found off Olive Trail. I mean, even in a small town, this was strangely close. Now, the problem was, again, Pam's case was unsolved. So, weird, yeah. Connected, maybe. There was some blood from the intruder left at Pam's house, and I know they tried to compare it to at least one of their known suspects, Robert Zabrowski, that traveling carny. But it wasn't a match for his blood type. So it seems like the idea of a connection, while there, didn't further the case. And the investigation into Darlene's murder slowed down as police got busy working other violent crimes in the area. In August 1986, a night manager at the Plymouth Dairy Queen was shot and killed at work. In October 1986, a 47-year-old woman died in a suspicious fire at her house in nearby Bremen. And on December 11, 1986, 11-year-old Brandy Peltz was sexually assaulted and strangled in her house in rural Argus, just 1.5 miles north of the Hulse home. Brandy's murder shocked the community that was still recovering from Darlene's murder. And Brandy's case even hit close to home for one of the Hulse daughters, Marie. She and Brandy had been in the same grade in school. That just tells you how small this town was.
She rode my bus, and she didn't go to school that day, and we were on the same bus route. And our house was further out than her house, and she was not on the bus, and we were coming home from school that day, and we saw smoke billowing out of her house. It just felt surreal, because that was just a couple years later, I think.
December 11th, 1986 had been a Thursday, and Brandy wasn't feeling well, so she stayed home from school. She was old enough to stay home alone, so Brandy's mom, Roxy, went to work at Holland's Hardware. During her lunch break that day, Roxy went home to check on her daughter and bring her some lunch. Everything was fine, so Roxy returned to work. And sometime after she got back, Brandy called her mom and said that someone had just called the house and was breathing heavily into the phone, but the person didn't say anything. Now, this had happened before, apparently, and it creeped them out, so Roxy had previously notified the telephone company, but she hadn't reported the calls to police. Now, because this had happened before, it was kind of part of their routine. Brandy let her mom know, but she said she felt safe and she felt fine at home. So they hung up, and her mom said she would see her after work. But later that day, around 3 p.m., a school teacher driving on Old Highway 31 saw smoke coming from the Peltz house. So he stopped at a neighbor's house and asked them to call the Argus Fire Department. He then went back to the Peltz home and went inside. First, he let out a barking dog, and then he walked around the first floor. And as he was yelling for anyone inside to get out, he went inside the bathroom and found Brandy's body in the tub. When police got there, they immediately noted the kitchen telephone had been ripped out of the wall receiver, which told them that Brandy likely tried to call for help when her killer came inside. They also thought that it looked as if her body had been placed in the tub after she was killed. The autopsy revealed that Brandy had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The water from the bathtub and the fire in the house were most likely efforts to cover up any evidence left behind. These days, if you go to Argus and ask locals about the unsolved murder, they bring up Brandy. This is the case that people remember, the little girl violated and murdered in her own home. Someone even self-published a novel about it, and even though it's fiction, the author admitted that it's about Brandy's case. Though most people from Argus dismissed the book entirely, calling it sensational and untrue. The South Bend Tribune ran an article on December 14, 1986, about how many calls police were getting about Brandy's murder. In the story, reporter John Wilcox wrote, "People here are concerned, remembering and wondering if there is any connection between the Pelt slaying Thursday and the yet unsolved August 1984 slaying of Darlene Hulse, who lived just 1.5 miles away." The Tribune quoted an anonymous co-worker of Roxy's who said, quote, "A lot of things like that are going through our minds. Quite a few people have been talking about it in private," end quote. That question was the right one. Are they connected? If they were, it meant investigators' worst fears were confirmed. Their killer wasn't some evil man just passing through town. He was living among them, and he wasn't done. Local police decided it was time to get some assistance from the feds. So Sergeant Yokelet wrote the FBI and spelled it all out in a letter.
The undersigned, investigating the homicides of Brandy Peltz and Darlene Hulse and the home invasion of Pam, has investigated these crimes from the standpoint of being individual cases, and that the assailants responsible for those cases are separate individuals and that these cases are unrelated. And it is only coincidence that they have occurred within a particular geographical area. At the same time, this officer has geared my investigations to include that very well, that all three of these cases may be linked together, and I base that opinion on several similarities that I feel exist in each of these cases.
You'll get the feds' take and a brand new suspect in episode 7, Bring in the FBI. You can listen to that right now.
Heck yeah. Yes, please.
Hi, it's Ted here, the unofficial spokesperson.
This episode of The Deck Investigates is brought to you by CarMax, a great place to get pre-qualified and buy your next used car. Because CarMax has you covered, even when times are tough, with affordable upfront pricing on thousands of vehicles. And you can even get pre-qualified and shop a nationwide inventory with your personalized monthly payment with no impact to your credit score. So you can save time searching and spend more time doing what you love and finding the car that's right for you. Get pre-qualified and learn more at CarMax.com. CarMax, car buying reimagined.
Anytime you're having trouble getting out of bed in the morning, just think about your favorite breakfast at McDonald's. See? Problem solved. Right now at McDonald's, wake up for a sausage McMuffin and hash browns. Mix and match 2 for just $3.69. More of a burrito person? We have you covered. Right now, get 2 sausage burritos for just $3.49. And remember to save time by ordering ahead on the app. Price of participation may vary. Single item at regular price. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
By January 1987, Marshall County authorities were noticing a pattern emerging. Here's an excerpt read from Sergeant Dave Yokelet's case summary.
In the past several years, since 1982, this officer has been involved in the investigating of several violent crimes that have occurred in the extreme southern portion of Marshall County, Indiana. 2 of those crimes involved homicides, one of which was in 1984, the Hulse homicide, the other in 1986, the Peltz homicide. In each of the 3 cases that have been investigated, I have found to be a 2-year interval. The geographical area and the close proximity of each of these cases are a concern of this investigator.
Yokelet starts that window of time in 1982 because he's including Pam's case. If you remember from last episode, Pam is the woman who survived a break-in and attempted rape in December of 1982. That was the first of the 3 cases. There's nothing I can find that shows what exactly the thread was that finally connected all 3. 38 years later, and the people in charge today say that they don't know either. But I think it was just one of those things, like an autostereogram. It's fuzzy until you see it. And then once the image within the picture emerges, you can't unsee it. Brandy was killed just 1.5 miles away from Darlene in the middle of the day. It's easy to see why Darlene's case, which was still fresh in everyone's mind, was compared. But unlike Darlene, Brandy got a harassing phone call before her death. And maybe that is the piece of red string that they were connecting from Brandy to Pam. Because if you remember, Pam too got a harassing call right before the intruder broke into her home. Once you're looking at Pam's case, you're reminded just how similar that was to Darlene's murder. Darlene's body was found just a stone's throw away from Pam's home. On their own, they can seem different, but all together, you see the picture, right? A triangle of connections from each case back to the other. Sergeant Dave Yocolet had no idea if he was right, but there was a way he could begin to find out. This is episode 7, Bring in the FBI. If the string connecting Pam and Brandy's case was the phone calls, then that is where police were going to start. For the first time, it seems. Because in December of 1987, there is documentation of police requesting the phone records for Pam's home from August of 1982 to January of 1983. They requested such a large window of time because Pam had other harassing phone calls prior to the break-in. She even got one after where the man breathed into the phone and said that he was the one who'd been inside her home. She reported all of those calls to police, but for some reason, officers never checked to see where the calls had come from in 1982. Or even in 1984 after Darlene was murdered and left in a wooded field right by Pam's house. So why now, you ask? Great question. One I'd love to get the answer to, but no one connected to the investigation has given us a solid answer. So I can only guess, but I think I have a good guess. It stems from the way I hear people, mostly men, talk about Pam's case now. They'll tell you, yeah, he broke in, but nothing happened. And I think that's how they thought about it then. Nothing really happened. After Darlene's murder, it's clear from the tips that were called in and the canvassing that was done that harassing phone calls were commonplace in Argus at the time. So even though a line had been crossed, a very serious, very physical line into Pam's home, it doesn't seem like a lot of resources were expended trying to figure out who that man was that crossed the line. Pam went on to live in fear after her attack. She always wondered what the man in her home was capable of, if he would escalate. And now, with a woman dead and a child dead, a child who had received a similar call, police were probably wondering if this guy had escalated. So now they decide to pull Pam's phone records. They got the call logs back almost immediately after requesting them in December of 1987. And that was it. Once they had those, Pam's case was solved. That easy. The harassing calls pointed to one man, a guy from nearby Culver, Indiana, named Kenneth McCune Jr. 2 calls prior to the break-in at Pam's house were made from Kenneth's home, and the one made to Pam's house just before the home invasion was from Kenneth's dad's barn where he worked. Now, Kenneth wasn't exactly a stranger to police, but he also wasn't considered a local bad boy the way that Ricky Mock and Danny Bender had been. While those guys seemed hard up for cash, Kenneth's criminal motivations seemed sexually driven because he had been accused of being a serial flasher. There had been several complaints made by women about a man flashing his penis in different places around the county, and one of those women specifically identified Kenneth. Police learned that Kenneth went to high school in Culver but lived in rural Marshall County, not too far from where Pam lived, and not too far from where Darlene's body was found. They also learned that he had worked as a farmhand on his uncle's farm, which was even closer to the woods where Darlene's body was found. He'd also worked as a bus driver for Culver School District and dabbled in used car sales throughout the 80s alongside his dad, Kenneth Sr. Now, they knew they had Kenneth Jr. for Pam's case. Along with the phone records pinning him as the caller, there was actually a tip early on in Pam's case from Kenneth's sister saying that she saw her brother's truck in front of Pam's house the morning of the crime. Now, she had a caveat in that very same statement saying that it wasn't her brother's truck, just one that looked exactly like it. But his name was there in their case file from just weeks after Pam's attack. But they weren't ready to move in on Kenneth just yet. If this was bigger than just Pam, they wanted to be sure. So Sergeant Yocolet pulled in the big guns, and he wrote to the FBI.
The undersigned, investigating the homicides of Brandy Peltz and Darlene Hulse and the home invasion of Pam, has investigated these crimes from the standpoint of being individual cases, and that the assailants responsible for those cases are separate individuals and that these cases are unrelated. And it is only coincidence that they have occurred within a particular geographical area. At the same time, this officer has geared my investigations to include that very well, that all three of these cases may be linked together, and I base that opinion on several similarities that I feel exist in each of these cases.
In total, the summary Sergeant Yocolet submitted was 5 pages long and went over every detail he knew of each crime. Yocolet was requesting help. He was looking for insight into what characteristics they could expect to find in the perpetrator of the Hulse homicide. But I also think by including information about the other cases, Sergeant Yocolet was trying to see if the FBI saw the same connection he did. From the response he got, it doesn't look like the FBI even acknowledged the other cases. They just honed in on the analysis of Darlene's case. But what FBI agent Thomas Saup had to say about the profile of Darlene's killer was very enlightening.
Anytime you're having trouble getting out of bed in the morning, just think about your favorite breakfast at McDonald's. See? Problem solved. Right now at McDonald's, wake up for a sausage McMuffin and hash browns. Mix and match 2 for just $3.69. More of a burrito person? We have you covered. Right now, get 2 sausage burritos for just $3.49. And remember to save time by ordering ahead on the app. Price of participation may vary. Single item at regular price. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Hey, Conan O'Brien here. Be honest, we could all use a friend. That's why I started an entire podcast about it. It's called Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend, and I really do. Each week I do my best to try to find some real friendships by hanging out with people like Tom Hanks, Maya Rudolph, Bruce Springsteen, Jack Black, and hundreds more. You can listen to my podcast and Team Coco Radio on SiriusXM, at home, or anywhere you are, no car required. Download the SiriusXM app for over 425 channels of ad-free music, sports, entertainment, and more.
Offender characteristics and traits. The offender in this case is a white male. Our experience and research reflects that the behavioral factors noted in this crime suggest that the offender would be from the low 20s to 30 years of age. Our research and experience reflects that offenders will dispose of victims' bodies in locations that are familiar to them. In this case, the remote, isolated area where the victim's body was found suggests that the offender had a strong familiarity with the area, which is most likely due to having lived, worked, or visited in the area. Our experience relates that the offender would not have more than a high school education and would not have done well scholastically. His school records would likely reflect disruptive behavior. He has an inadequate personality and is lacking in interpersonal skills. He has a difficult time relating to females and feels insecure when in their company. Any relationships with females would be marked with conflict or even physical violence. His choice of female companionship would be with someone considerably younger than him, that he would be able to dominate. We would expect him to be living alone or with a significant family member, such as a domineering mother, older sister, or grandmother, upon whom he is somewhat dependent. He would be described by others as a loner and likely does not have a close circle of friends. The brutality at the crime scene reflects anger, resulting from short or long-term stressors in the offender's life experiences. Our research and experience reflect that these precipitating stressors can be the result of conflict with a significant female in the offender's life, employment pressures, death of a significant person, etc. The use of drugs or alcohol by the offender in this case should not be ruled out. Although the offender apparently brought duct tape with him, the crime scene does not reflect a great deal of criminal sophistication. The offender likely has a police record that would reflect assaultive-type behavior, possibly sexual assault, and drug or alcohol-related violations. If the offender is employed, it would be in unskilled to semi-skilled work, and he would have a spotty work record, which also reflects an inability to work well with others. The time of the assault also indicates that the offender did not have to account for his time on that morning. If the offender owns a vehicle, it would reflect his financial and social standing in the community. Post-offensive behavior. After disposing of the victim's body, the offender would have gone to a location he considered safe to decompress. He would not have any remorse for his crime, and his only concern would be a fear of being connected to the crime. He would have cleaned the blood from his clothes. However, our experience indicates that this offender would not be likely to dispose of the clothes he wore during the commission of the crime. The offender would have become reclusive for several days following the crime and would have tried to establish an alibi in case he was questioned by the police. If he was employed, he may have provided a reason to be absent from work the day after the crime. His physical appearance would have deteriorated more than usual, and if he uses drugs or alcohol, his consumption of those products would have increased. Persons who know him well would have recognized his increased anxiety. If contacted by the police, he likely would have appeared cooperative, but would have claimed no knowledge about the crime. He would probably have followed the progress of the investigation through the media and by overhearing others in the community. However, the offender would not be likely to engage in conversation about the crime.
At the time, there was only one person to hold up against this profile and compare: Kenneth McCune Jr. On one hand, a few of the characteristic traits matched McCune to a T. Familiar with the area? Check. Only a high school degree? Check. Odd jobs, no established career? Check, check. He even slightly resembled the suspect description with his long, skinny nose. But one thing that didn't match was the fact that Kenneth was married with kids. Knowing what they knew about Kenneth's alleged flashing habits, that fact puzzled investigators. It seems that in 1988, Yokelet tried to talk to Kenneth specifically about Darlene's case. Here's a reenactment of that transcript.
Kenny, you're familiar with the investigation I've been conducting into the death of Darlene Hulse?
Yes.
Were you familiar with Darlene Hulse?
I knew where she lived.
Okay. Now, how was it you knew where she lived?
Well, one time, me and my dad had baled some straw or some hay down a road, and when that happened, the way it was described to me where it had happened was associated with that particular year we baled the hay, as far as, my memory goes.
You never seen Mrs. Hulse when you were baling hay or driving up and down the road?
I could, yeah, I think.
Do you remember where you saw her at?
I think I went down in front of the house and the kids were outside or something. I'm not sure.
Were there any other times, other than this, that you saw Mrs. Hulse anywhere?
I wouldn't know if I would recognize her, walking down the street or anything, no.
That was only part of the transcript of Kenneth's interview with Sergeant Yokelet. We have this part because the recording of that interview was played during a court proceeding that we did a records request for. That's the only part they played in court, and we don't have documentation of the full interview, so I'm not sure where the conversation went from there. And we weren't able to find any further documentation about how or even if they tried to connect Kenneth to Darlene's case back in 1987. And obviously, a few similarities in an FBI profile aren't enough to accuse him of murder. So later that year, they just moved forward with cases that they did have evidence for. In November 1987, police charged Kenneth with public indecency for one of the flashing incidents, the one where the victim identified him. And a month later, they arrested him for the 1982 home invasion and attempted rape of Pam. At first, Kenneth had denied the crime. But when he realized that police not only had record of him calling and harassing her, but they also had collected blood on her doorframe where the intruder had cut himself and it belonged to him, the jig was up. Kenneth admitted to everything and took a plea deal for a lesser charge of burglary. The prosecutor just dropped the attempted rape charge altogether. Oh, and that indecent exposure case, that actually went to trial. Kenneth was acquitted, but according to the transcript from his 1989 sentence modification hearing, he admitted that it was actually him. Now, I want to take just 2 seconds and acknowledge how infuriating this must have been for Pam. All these years, they had the evidence they needed to solve her case, but it took 2 more people dying for them to thoroughly investigate it. And when they finally did, the end result had to feel like what they were saying all along. Well, nothing really happened to you. He just broke in. She deserved to be believed from the beginning. And I guess delayed justice is better than nothing, but it meant that she lived in fear for nearly 5 years before Kenneth was finally arrested. Despite being caught in a lie over Pam's assault, Kenneth denied having anything to do with Darlene's murder. He went on to serve time in prison until 1991, and then he went on to live a crime-free life. His wife stayed with him. They raised their daughters. He kept a job and even volunteered in his community. Now, we don't have access to any of the reports or documentation on Brandy's case, so I don't know if Kenneth was ever questioned about her murder. We asked prosecutor Nelson Chipman, who is in charge of that case today, if they were ever able to trace the call Brandy got before her murder, and if any calls were linked back to Kenneth McCune. But he wouldn't say. I would highly doubt anything in Brandy's case was ever linked back to Kenneth. Like I mentioned last episode, her case went on to garner far more attention, and he has never been named by anyone official or otherwise in connection to the case. Like I said last episode, after Brandy was murdered, her death really overshadowed Darlene's. And former Sergeant Dave Yocolette seemed to take offense today when I told them Darlene's name isn't known around town, because they say they remember it so well. But it's the truth. After 1987, Darlene's case had come to a screeching halt, and it stayed there for damn near 40 years. That is until the one daughter, who was too young to remember anything, started asking questions.
I remember Dad saying, if you have any questions, you can go ask Marie Melissa. So I started inquiring then.
You were young. We always told you. I don't remember, like you said, it was never a secret.
Do you remember how old you were when you started asking your sister's questions?
Probably 7 or 8. I remember sitting on the steps in the garage and asking some things. And I'll never forget one time Melissa said the one thing that she regrets was not getting me, not grabbing me when they were running out. And I think that's kind of piqued my interest. Like, what do you mean? Like, where was I? What was going on? So then started asking more. And I just always told myself, when I get older, I'm gonna do some digging and see what I can find, or if I can ask questions that I want to know about to the detectives. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And then it got to a point about 7 years ago where I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this.
What Kristen would go on to do would completely change the trajectory of her mother's case. That's next in episode 8. It all goes through one guy. You can listen to that right now.
Bedtime is rough, even for Peanut. That's why people will try anything to fall asleep. Headstands before bed, even blowing bubbles. But Ashley has a trick that works every time. A new Tempur-Pedic mattress. It adapts to your body's needs to help you fall asleep faster and stay asleep longer. You'll wake up feeling refreshed every day. Even Peanut agrees. So ditch the wacky bedtime rituals. Head to Ashley to take home a Tempur-Pedic today.
Anytime you're having trouble getting out of bed in the morning, just think about your favorite breakfast at McDonald's. See? Problem solved. Right now at McDonald's, wake up for a sausage McMuffin and hash browns. Mix and match 2 for just $3.69. More of a burrito person? We have you covered. Right now, get 2 sausage burritos for just $3.49. And remember to save time by ordering ahead on the app. Price and participation may vary. Single item at regular price. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
This episode of The Deck Investigates is brought to you by CarMax, a great place to get pre-qualified and buy your next used car. Because CarMax has you covered, even when times are tough, with affordable upfront pricing on thousands of vehicles. And you can even get pre-qualified and shop a nationwide inventory with your personalized monthly payment with no impact to your credit score. So you can save time searching and spend more time doing what you love and finding the car that's right for you. Get pre-qualified and learn more at CarMax.com. CarMax, car buying reimagined.
Anytime you're having trouble getting out of bed in the morning, just think about your favorite breakfast at McDonald's. See? Problem solved. Right now at McDonald's, wake up for a sausage McMuffin and hash browns. Mix and match 2 for just $3.69. More of a burrito person? We have you covered. Right now, get 2 sausage burritos for just $3.49. And remember to save time by ordering ahead on the app. Price of participation may vary. Single item at regular price. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
In 2016, Kristen was all grown up and a mom of her own when she decided to take her mom's cold case into her own hands.
It got to a point about 7 years ago where I was like, okay, I want to do this. I was sitting at home with little kids, and I just started reaching out, like, hey, is there anything new, anything going on? Who can I talk to? And a lot of them were, no, there's nothing new. There's nothing I can tell you because I don't know anything, type of thing.
She was asking all those questions over the phone and via email from hundreds of miles away. So it's not like she could just march down to the prosecutor's office and demand answers. You see, it had been decades since Kristen or any of her immediate family members had lived in Indiana. Back in 1989, 5 years after Darlene's murder, Ron got a new job opportunity with the door manufacturing company. So the Holtz family moved away from Argus, and not just out of town, to a whole different state. This is episode 8. It all goes through one guy. By then, Ron and his wife, Chris, had also added a son to the family. So Marie, Melissa, and Kristen had a new baby brother. Tons of changes for their family in just 5 years. So the girls were a bit hesitant about leaving Argus. It was the only place they'd ever called home, even though it was a constant reminder of their family's biggest tragedy.
I was not excited because I was leaving all my friends and all of our family was there. I was not excited. And the South is so different from the North. The only part I was looking forward to moving down here is because I got my own room. They're like, we're gonna get you your own room. I was like, okay, that works.
From 1984 to 1989, the family was defined by what happened to Darlene and the failed investigation into finding her killer. The move wasn't exactly intended to be a fresh start for them, but in many ways it was. They settled in, and all of a sudden, no one at school knew the horrible thing that had happened to their family. Of course, they would visit family members back in Argus every so often.
I mean, we would try and go back twice a year, but then they got fewer and further between after that. But we would go back for a long time.
But it got to the point where they sort of dreaded going back there. They figured if a huge breakthrough ever came in Darlene's case, someone would let them know. But in the 30-plus years since, no one ever called. So when Kristen started making calls about her mom's case back in 2016, she was frustrated to learn that nothing had been done in years. She found out the case file was essentially sitting on a shelf in Marshall County Prosecutor Nelson Chipman's office in Plymouth, Indiana.
So I reached out to Nelson, and he talked to me because he remembered about Mom's case. He said he had her picture up in his office still, but that there was nothing new going on with it.
Of course, Kristen's next question was, well, how do we change that? She pushed and pushed, call after call, but she felt like she was getting nowhere. Kristen even arranged an in-person meeting with Prosecutor Chipman, and he basically dismissed her, saying that what's been done has been done and there's not much else he can do.
I said, you guys, the case files are just sitting there collecting dust. And he leaned across his desk. He goes, you don't think I know that? I was like, well, obviously nothing is going to get done when it's just sitting there. You know, have a fresh pair of eyes look at it, something, you know, do the touch DNA testing. After that meeting I had with him, when I left, I got up and left his office in tears. And we haven't spoken since then.
Kristen left that meeting not knowing if anything would even happen. And Marie knew how hard Kristen had worked for years by that point, trying to get some movement in their mom's case. So, being the big sister she is, Marie called Prosecutor Chipman.
I said, you know, you don't understand what it's like. I said, you don't have this in your life. And I said, you need to be a little more gentler with her because you are coming off rude and you've got to understand where she's coming from. And I just think he's lost that sense, that touch of things, because it's not his personal life. And I get that, but you still don't need to talk that way. A little more kinder.
There were no apologies or mending fences. Instead, Nelson assigned someone in his office to act as a liaison between Kristen and himself. But maybe something about what Maurice said tugged at his heartstrings. Or maybe Kristen's persistence paid off. Either way, Kristen was shocked, surprised, encouraged, all the emotions when in 2019, Prosecutor Chipman was in the local news talking about how they were planning to use new DNA technology to try and solve Darlene's case once and for all.
Detectives are not giving up. Right now, they are starting over with fresh eyes, once again tracking down persons of interest and conducting interviews. Chipman also says they're choosing new pieces of evidence to send to the Indiana State Police Crime Lab.
Kristen was hopeful. She could feel answers just around the corner. But around the same time, that liaison that Nelson had appointed, Kelly, who'd been keeping Kristen in the loop on stuff that was going on in the case, she left Nelson's office for a different job. She still tried to keep up to date on the investigation in order to text Kristen updates, but new information was scarce after that. It took some time, so much so that Kristen thought the ball had been dropped yet again. But at some point, she heard that they had gotten some kind of DNA off some piece of evidence, but the details were fuzzy. Now, she knew nothing was going to happen overnight, but months were going by, and then years. February 2021 was when I came across that 2018 news story. I had stumbled across Darlene's story and become a little obsessed, as I've been known to do. But there was just nothing. A big void where I expected answers were sure to be. Now, normally I'd set my Google alerts and wait for something to pop, but I don't know what it was about this one. Instead, I found Kristen on Facebook and sent her a DM. And that message put us on a wild journey that I could have never imagined.
Anytime you're having trouble getting out of bed in the morning, just think about your favorite breakfast at McDonald's. See? Problem solved. Right now at McDonald's, wake up for a sausage McMuffin and hash browns. Mix and match 2 for just $3.69. More of a burrito person? We have you covered. Right now, get 2 sausage burritos for just $3.49. And remember to save time by ordering ahead on the app. Price and participation may vary. Single item at regular price. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Hey, this is Jeff Lewis from Radio Andy, live and uncensored. Catch me talking with my friends about my latest obsessions, relationship issues, and bodily ailments. With that kind of drama that seems to follow me, you never know what's going to happen.
You can listen to Jeff Lewis live at home or anywhere you are. Download the SiriusXM app for over 425 channels of ad-free music, sports, entertainment, and more. Subscribe now and get 3 months free. Offer details apply.
After my message to Kristen, we hopped on a phone call and she got me up to speed with everything she'd been doing since 2016, which included not just pushing the prosecutor's office, but doing some sleuthing of her own, creating maps, connecting important events through newspaper archives. But she said that she was stuck. What needed to happen was DNA testing, which brought us full circle to the reason for me reaching out. My big question was, well, what the hell happened after that article in 2019? And she said she had no idea. She explained to me the falling out that she had with Prosecutor Nelson, and by 2021, his liaison no longer worked in his office. Her only lifeline of communication was gone. So really, she had no idea exactly what evidence they had or what was happening with it. I worked with a lot of good people in law enforcement, and I've worked with a lot of families. And this kind of rift that happens is something that I'll never fully understand, but it happens. I knew there was no fixing it by the time we came in, but maybe there could be a bridge. Maybe we could be that bridge, is what I was hoping. When I asked Kristen if she wanted our help, I'll be honest, she wasn't jumping. I mean, don't get me wrong, she wasn't against it, but I think over the years, she learned to keep her hopes tempered. So instead, she gave me a resounding, at this point, it wouldn't hurt. We dipped our toes in slowly. Kristen sent us everything she had, and we tried wrapping our heads around the case, one little piece of the puzzle at a time. By 2022, I had assigned our reporter Emily to start digging into Darlene's case full time. And like any good reporter, she knows that you gotta get to the source. And the source in this case is prosecutor Nelson Chipman. So she started there. It took several phone calls to Chipman's office before he even called her back. And when we asked for a sit-down interview with him, this is what he said.
Why would I? I don't understand. It's just foreign to us to conduct interviews during an investigation. I know this is a cold case. I know that that's different. But to be doing interviews about evidence, is just very uncomfortable.
Foreign, says the guy who had gone on local TV saying he was reopening the case.
What's changed between then and now that makes you not want to do another interview? I mean, isn't it always worth trying?
Say that again? What was the last part?
Isn't it always worth trying just to get some new publicity out there in case it does spark someone's memory?
Well, who's listening to your podcast?
You're listening, right? Even if Nelson doesn't think anything will come of this, he's the gatekeeper. And I know this because we also tried getting interviews with the Indiana State Police and the Marshall County Sheriff's Office, even the State Crime Lab. And they all say that we have to talk to Nelson, that he is in charge of the case. And I just have to preface this by saying it's unusual for a prosecutor to be the gatekeeper of a case that has never even been close to an arrest. He's not a detective, and his office doesn't have detectives. But when we asked him why he had it, he said that he just inherited it from the prosecutor before him. Like at some point, Darlene's case went from the jurisdiction of the Marshall County Sheriff's Office to the Indiana State Police and then the Marshall County Prosecutor's Office. But no one really has a logical explanation for why that happened, or any real plans to transfer it again. But Emily is nothing if not persistent. Let me just pop by your office and we can have a conversation, she said. And reluctantly, he agreed.
I think it'll be worth our time either way.
All right.
Okay, thanks, Nelson. I
hope I don't regret it.
Emily traveled to Plymouth, Indiana for that meeting. And the first thing Nelson did was take her to see the photo of Darlene that he keeps on the wall in his office.
What has made you want to keep that up on your wall?
Just a reminder what we're here for.
Our big goal for that first meeting with Nelson, which was in September 2022, was to see what results, if any, they had gotten from the new DNA testing they allegedly tried around 2018 or 2019. And keep in mind, Nelson talks in circles, and sometimes the details are fuzzy or he says he can't answer a question. But about a half an hour into the interview, he started to open up a bit. And he said, okay, yes. After Kristen and I had our disagreement, I sent off a piece of evidence for MVAC testing, and the results were exciting, but, quote, not a slam dunk.
So it sounds like you got something partial.
Right, and it identifies a male.
An unknown male?
Yeah, right. They don't have a standard to go with. If we had a standard, you'd be here taking pictures of a perp walk or something, right?
A partial profile isn't enough to put in CODIS, but it is enough to do direct comparison tests.
Do you have DNA swabs for the suspects in the case?
I can't talk about that.
So Nelson wouldn't say if they were in the process of doing any direct comparisons with suspects or persons of interest, but he was sort of willing to theorize about what he thinks happened to Darlene. And his theories, even decades after the crime, are very similar to what Sergeant Dave Yocolet was theorizing back in the 80s. Though they're still in touch today, so that's likely where the theory came from.
I think it's one person. I think it was sex-driven. You would think that the person would have the tendency of done something like that before, and would have done something like that after, you would think. Amateur. I'm an amateur. That paradigm, that way of perspective of for me has proven useful through the years of if I'm going to go into a courtroom, those people in there in the jury box, they're going to know less than, and I need to convince them. So if I'm going to convince them, I need to be convinced.
Do you think it was someone who has really strong local ties, who lived here at the time and sounds like still might be in the area?
You're not going to let up, are you?
When we asked Nelson to explain how he managed to have a falling out with a victim's daughter, he said that when she first reached out, he was really open with her about investigative information, and that he was getting criticized by certain people, quote unquote, on his side for being too open. And then everything came to a head when they met in person. Nelson even accused Kristen of lying about her grandfather's funeral in order to come to Indiana to meet with him.
It was a bad scene, and she was very emotional. She'd come up here. She said she came up here for a family funeral, and but she couldn't tell me where it was or whatever was going on. I think it was just an excuse to get here, and which is fine. I could feel for her, but it was very uncomfortable.
For the record, I don't think it matters why Kristen was in Indiana. I mean, she has a right to meet with authorities in charge of solving her mom's case anytime she wants. But just in case anyone's wondering, her grandpa did in fact die. We found the obituary complete with funeral service information.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame them for wanting answers.
Oh yeah, and I felt bad. And, I hate for it to have ended like that, but and I sure as hell hate like if in a 14 months, 16 months, whatever it is, 18 months, and I'm gone, I sure hope whoever takes over, if it's going to be Tammy, that they take over with as much passion.
Passion. Prosecutor Chipman is saying that he hopes whoever takes over his job will have as much passion as him when it comes to trying to solve Darlene's murder. But this guy talks a lot about retirement. He's been in the role for a decade, and when Emily met with him in September 2022, he was in the middle of running for re-election, and he ran unopposed, so he won the bid for Marshall County prosecutor in November 2022. But he says he'll be retired by 2024. He also talks a lot about how busy his office is and how huge their workload is and how they don't have a dedicated investigator working on Darlene's case.
Do you wish you had a full-time cold case investigator looking at both of these cases?
I couldn't justify that. If it was supplied, yeah, it would be great. But just 2 cases. We had 3, but everybody seems to think pretty well that the suspect on the 3rd one is deceased.
So apparently, in Nelson's opinion, 2 unsolved murders isn't enough to justify a dedicated homicide investigator. And unfortunately, passion without action ain't gonna cut it. So Emily and I decided we'll do it. We'll investigate Darlene's case. And we'll start from scratch. What we didn't realize in the fall of 2022, after that first meeting with Nelson, was just how much more there was to uncover. Part of that meant staying on Nelson's good side, because the guy's a talker. You can tell he wants to talk and be a part of this. And to his credit, he gave us time, a lot more than we expected. So Emily thought, why not ask for just a little more? She asked if he would take her out to the crime scene.
Yeah, if you want to go that way, I can lead you that way.
Yeah? Let's do it.
Nelson escorted Emily himself, past Darlene's house and the patch of woods where her body was found. And along the way, he opened up more about his real theory of Darlene's murder. And it gave us a really great place to start our investigation. That's in episode 9. Let's go for a ride. You can listen to that right now.
bedtime is rough, even for Peanut. That's why people will try anything to fall asleep. Headstands before bed, even blowing